welcome to the first episode of my new podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers, which is my adventures and research into my hobby of living history. My name is Caitlin and I'll be your hostess. I have 20 plus years experience in sewing and 12 plus years experience in living history. This podcast is going to explore historic wardrobes and clothing, myth debunking, stories, and experiences from living history events, and also some of how I've incorporated living history into my everyday life, or at least the things I've learned in living history in my everyday life. If any of that sounds interesting to you, consider following along so you're notified anytime I upload a new episode. We're going to start off today with exploring a recent YouTube video I put out on Victorian myth busting, dress edition. So we debunked 3 dress myths for the Victorian era. We're basically going to do the no visuals required version of the video, as well as kind of responding to a couple of the common comments that I got. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first myth I looked into was the myth that it took so long to get dressed back then. Because of all those underpinnings, people think that it took forever just to be able to get dressed in the morning. And you'll see this myth in a variety of ways, with museum visitors asking things like, how early do you have to get up to get dressed like that? Or how long does it take to put that on? Or event spectators putting out statements such as, you can't be wearing all the layers they did. It took so long for them to get dressed and poor people didn't wear that sort of thing. Or you need a lady's maid or a servant to help you get dressed because you can't lace a corset by yourself. So lots of variations of the same thought concept. We today have a very skewed idea of Victorian clothing and its purpose, and especially the purposes of all the layers that are involved. We also have a very skewed idea of Victorian social classes and how clothing differed from social classes. We think that more clothes equal wealthier, whereas everyone's, at least in the Western culture, everyone's wearing the same amount of clothes. It's the quality of the fabrics in the clothes, and sometimes the designs and trims that give social class cues as opposed to the amount of clothing you're wearing. I've personally found that romance authors are particularly bad at this, especially in terms of understanding how long a process getting dressed actually is. Because when you look at all the layers, you're going, okay, there's chemise and there's drawers and there's corsets and petticoats and multiple petticoats in the dress, and it seems like it would take a very long time. And so even when they do basic surface level research and think they understand things, they really don't. Either because they have not put into practice, or they've tried it once or twice and it did take them a long time and they're like, oh, well, this just must have been how it was all the time. It is my opinion that if you are an author, any type of historical author where you're talking about historical dress whatsoever, only doing surface level research on something that's commonplace and as intimate as the clothes people are wearing really takes you out of the illusion that you're trying to create as an author. But unfortunately, I have not come across a single historical fiction author who is good at writing about clothing. And that's not necessarily any fault of their own. It's taken me 12 plus years of research just to get where I am today, which is a spot where I realize how little I actually know. So to debunk this myth of how long it took them to get dressed, the only period reference that I found off the top of my head that I remember reading was Elizabeth Custers, who is George Armstrong Custer's wife. She followed him around on his journeys throughout the forts and that sort of thing, the western frontier. So after the Civil War, she was traveling with him across Texas. There's a book published of her diary. Tenting on the Plains is the Texas section of her travels. And Mrs. Custer proudly writes in her diary one day that her husband secretly timed how long it took her to get dressed one morning without knowing that she was being timed. Well, she was able to bathe and dress within 7 minutes. She talks about this being one of her very few achievements as a soldier, or attributes as a soldier that she's been able to acquire. This is a source of pride for her that she can do this within 7 minutes, which tells me that it's probably a very good time, or at least Mrs. Custer considers it to be a very good time. So what about an average time? If 7 minutes to bathe and dress is a good time, what is the average time? Well, I have 12 plus years experience of getting dressed in these clothes. I used to do it somewhat for a living. I would do it about 3 to 4 times a week, off and on when I worked in museums. So I do have quite a bit of experience getting dressed in all these layers, and I think I can give a pretty good average time. You're not trying to rush at all, but just trying to get dressed the same way on any other day I would get dressed in modern clothes. Just not rushed, but I'm probably not going to take an awful long time because I am so accustomed to doing this. For me, getting dressed in 19th century clothing is muscle memory, at least for the 1860s. Some of the other time periods I haven't been doing them as long, so it's a little bit maybe not the best time that someone who's doing this every day could accomplish. But I did want, in the interest of fairness, to do a couple of different time periods. So I chose 3 different time periods. I did 1830, 1860, and 1880. Even though 1830 specifically is a little bit earlier than Victorian era, all I really had to do was change out to my 1838 dress, which I didn't process in my brain that I could do. So we went for 1830, 1860, and 1880. And for social class, I didn't want to do like wealthy upper class, because we're talking about the average woman. So I'm doing upper working class essentially, or what would be considered a working class. I'm working for a living, or my husband at least is working for a living. So just average working class, which is where the vast majority of people fell, was in the working class. But I also didn't want to do, dirt poor, labor. I wanted to do like a decent everyday upper working class dress. So starting with the 1830s, I went with what I, in my current research, have found to be the American way of dressing, which is without split crotch drawers. So no underwear type garment whatsoever. Drawers do seem to appear in England, but the few references I have found say they are not typical in America. So I had my chemise on, and I put on stockings, knitted garters, my boots, my corset, which unfortunately took me a very long time, because the last time I wore this corset, I had set it underneath a candle on the wall. So there was a sconce on the wall, and then like a little plate, and there's a candlestick on the plate. And the candle was melting because it was lit. It was nighttime. There was about dozen and a half people at this event. It was after hours, so we were, of course, all doing singing and music, just having a grand old time together. I was going to go to bed early, and I got undressed, and I didn't realize that I had set my corset underneath a candle, which the wax was dripping off of, because the candle plate where the candle was sitting wasn't very wide. So the more candles I put on, just in the melted wax, the more it just kind of overflowed the plate and was now dripping onto my corset. So my entire 1830s corset right now is caked in wax. And wax-crested corset strings, let me tell you, are very hard to get through the tiny little eyelet holes. So it did take me a good bit longer, but I did not count off time for this. I felt that it was unnecessary and would be cheating if I had. For skirt support, I put on a petticoat, a quarter petticoat, and then another petticoat over top of that, and then it was time for the dress. I could have also put on pockets above the topmost petticoat, but I don't have to. Pockets were not necessarily entirely necessary, and also that utmost petticoat does technically have pockets in the skirt. So the Workwoman's Guide did mention that you could put, sew pockets into the skirts of your petticoat. And so my uppermost petticoat does actually have pockets inside. So you don't necessarily need pockets if you don't want them. My dress already had the sleeve puffs inside, because this is the 1830s, so we have giant sleeves. And then for accessories, I chose a belt to go around my waist, a bonnet, and a parasol. And so for 1830s, it took me 10 minutes and 37 seconds to get dressed. And I would say that's probably a little on the long side for me, just because of those pesky wax caked corset strings. It did take me, I don't know, I would probably only shave off maybe a minute or two. So it probably on an average day would take me 8 to 9 minutes to get dressed in 1830s. I did get a cautionary comment where someone like, well, you shouldn't have left a candle going. And I guess I didn't explain it very well in the video, but it was a party. And so there were tons and tons of people around, and they were the ones looking after candles. I just went to bed early. And so the candle, I wasn't going to blow it out, because there are people in the room who need the light. They're reading music, they're reading stories, they're talking to each other. They need the light. And so I just inadvertently set my corset in a corner where I felt it would be out of the way for all the people, without realizing that there was a candle on the wall above it. So it just dripped down, and the candle did get put out when everyone else went to bed. It was not left unattended, let's say. We are living historians, we are experts in fire, and until you really do living history, you really don't understand how much fire was an everyday constant in the 19th century, whether it be candles, the hearth fire, stove fires, outside fires. There's fires everywhere. We always have fires going. And I don't think you really understand that until you are living in the 19th century, even if it's just for the weekend. So you get very good at fire safety. So going back to the 1830s, I also decided to time myself getting undressed, just for the romance authors who feel like it's necessary to talk about how long it's taking people to get undressed. Now, again, there is no such thing as at least in America, underwear type garments, so there really is no reason to get fully undressed. You can just lift skirts and have at it if that's what you're into. If you are in England and someone who's wearing split crotch drawers, they are split crotch. Again, there is no reason to get fully undressed, but just in case you wanted to get fully undressed, it took me 1 minute and 30 seconds. And of course, that did include me entirely having to unlace the corset because there is no front opening corset bust that I can just, pop off. I had to fully unlace everything. So moving on to the 1860s, split crotch drawers are going to be far more common at this point, so I am going to wear them. Even though I hate them, we're going to wear them. So I have my stockings, I have elastic garters now, my elastic boots, which are very easy to put on, which is why I love them, my cotton chemise, I have a cotton pair of split crotch drawers, I have my corset, and then I put on a petticoat, my crinoline, so my hoop skirt, and then another petticoat. And after that, went on a regular old cotton dress. It already had collar and cuffs already set into it. And then I accessorized with a velvet belt, a bonnet, and a parasol. It took me 6 minutes and 31 seconds to get dressed in the 1860s. And that is including the time that it took me, because I put the drawers on and the button popped. And then I paused the video while I went to go look for a pin, because in a normal dressing situation, you would be dressing by your dressing table, which would have pins on it. And so you wouldn't have to go search for a pin, but I wasn't expecting my button to pop off, and I wasn't in my normal dressing spot, so I didn't have my pins with me. So I stopped the timer to go get my pins, and then I set them down and just started getting the pin. So I had to put my drawers on twice, and there's also a giant knot in my corset string that I had to take out, but I did not stop the timer for that because that's just a normal thing that happens sometimes. So again, 6 minutes and 31 seconds, including having to put drawers on twice and having to untangle corset strings. Now to get undressed, this particular time it took me 1 minute and 24 seconds because I was not rushing. As I said before, I didn't want to rush any of this. I have clocked myself at 30 to 40 seconds. I don't remember quite. It was one of those two. It's either 30 or 40 seconds getting undressed in 1860s. If I am highly motivated, I can get undressed almost instantly. I just was not highly motivated. I was doing the average what it would take me to get undressed. But yes, I have clocked myself at well under a minute getting undressed in 1860s. And then for the 1880s, so I wore a cotton chemise and pair of drawers. You could also do combinations, which is a chemise and drawers put together into one garment. I hate my combinations, so I chose chemise and drawers. I own original 1880s chemise and drawers, so I know they were still an option, although combinations were starting to get a little bit more common. Put on stockings, the elastic garters, my boots, my 1870s corset, a petticoat, a bustle, and then another petticoat. Then came a two-piece dress, which I expressly copied from an original in my collection. It's a little bit of a weird gown, and the way the skirt comes up, it's just weird. But again, it's copied from an original, so it's perfectly very correct. You don't wear belts with those types of garments, so I did a watch and watch chain instead to kind of just make it even with the other two time periods. And again, a bonnet and a parasol. My time for the 1880s was 6 minutes and 17 seconds. And to undress in the 1880s, it took me 1 minute and 15 seconds. So all that to show that it does not take a long time to get dressed and undressed in the 19th century, regardless of the particular time period you're speaking of. And I like to consider my time a good average time. I mean, it's definitely not Mrs. Custer's bathe and dress in 7 minutes time, but it's a decent average time that someone who has a lot of experience dressing like this, as the 19th century woman would have had, what you can do when you actually know what you're doing. Now, of course, my times that I just mentioned do not count for things such as hairdressing or personal hygiene or anything of that nature that a woman may choose to do in the mornings. Times are going to vary as you add those things, and also think about the wearer's ability. I had a comment mention that the commenter was disabled, so it took her longer to get dressed, which absolutely makes sense. So my times today are likely a very good average, outside of the caked corset strings, disabilities, not being accustomed to dressing in this manner, or trying to put on clothes that don't fit, that sort of thing. It really shouldn't take one more than 10 or 15 minutes to get dressed in the 19th century if they're accustomed to doing it as 19th century women were. And there's nothing wrong with being inexperienced with putting on clothes from the 19th century. If you're new to this, that's absolutely not a problem here. We just don't need to be taking those examples of people who are brand new at dressing this manner and toting it as, oh, look how long it took people to get dressed back then. Well, yes, it took them a long time because they're not used to it. Anything that's not muscle memory is going to take someone longer than someone who's used to doing it all the time. And so when people who are just brand new are talking about how long it takes to get dressed, well, yes, it will, until you get more practiced. So when you look at how long it took people to get dressed, diaries, the period stories starring young women, and the experiences of living historians who are going out and doing this several times a week are going to be your best bet in figuring out really how long it took to get dressed, which really isn't all that long, or at least not as long as we today think it took them. So the second myth I looked at in the YouTube video was very similar to the first. It's a myth that poor people didn't wear all the layers because A, they didn't have time to dress like that, B, they didn't have funds for all that clothing, or C, they didn't have servants to get dressed because everyone knows you have to have a servant to get you dressed in a corset. So we've already debunked not having enough time to get dressed because it really does not take that much time to get dressed. And working class women may change some slight layers. For instance, in the 1860s, a working woman may or may not be wearing a crinoline depending on the woman herself and her profession. They could be wearing crinolines by working. We have plenty of photographic evidence of that, but they also could not, and we have plenty of photographic evidence for that as well. But otherwise, we do see poor women wearing the same layers. So an example I used in the video was of a desolate woman in the 1840s who had a child out of wedlock and she had another one on the way. She was being admitted to a workhouse or a poorhouse. So she gave birth in the poorhouse, and afterwards it's recorded that she cut up her nightgown, her nightcap, and another garment to make the baby clothing so that she'd be allowed to leave. And then she put on her other clothing, the remainder of her clothing, which consisted of a cotton chemise, stays, a petticoat with a body, a dress, stockings, shoes, and a bonnet. And they are specifically noted that all these garments are in good condition. So basically the 1830s layers minus an extra petticoat. And for those of you who are wondering, a petticoat with a body essentially looks a lot like what we consider a dress. It's basically almost like a slip. So the petticoat, which we would think is just a skirt, has a top attached to it, and it usually has very short sleeves, and it's made out of underwear fabric. So it's made out of the plain white cotton, typically a long cloth is what they would call it, the underwear fabric. And so it's almost like a corset cover and petticoat in one. Now for the last comment about not being able to get dressed without a servant, I am fully able to get dressed entirely in the 19th century in any time period by myself without assistance, except for back closing bodices. I struggle with back closing bodices. I can get the ones that in the very early 19th century, like Regency, and then up into the 1830s where we're using ties to close our bodices. I can get a waist tie and a neck tie. As long as there's no ties in the middle, I can do that. The problem with me specifically is I have short little T-Rex arms that are about 2.5 inches shorter than the average woman's arms of my height. So I can't physically reach back there to do much of anything. But I do have friends who can put themselves into back closing bodices on their own. So I know it's physically possible for some people, it's just not for me. So I do need assistance if I'm doing back closing bodices. Personally, I do find that even in time periods where back closing bodices are the norm, you will see more front closing bodices in working class situations. And that's not saying that most working class women were wearing front closing bodices. I'm just saying that when you take the fancier dresses and you take what the average woman would be wearing, you see more front closing bodices in the second category than you do in the first. But they still kind of exist in both, if that makes sense. I think most people today have the image of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, clinging to the bedpost while being laced into a corset. And that's just generally not true. Were there people who tight-laced? Absolutely, there were. And then there were certain peoples and people groups who were more prone to tight-lacing, but not everyone was. And quite frankly, if you ever do Regency or 1830s, you really can't tight-lace yourself in those corsets. But you really can't. You'll be ripping out the corset before you get anywhere as far as tight-lacing. So that's a whole other concept for another video. But to be fair to the modern filmmakers, there are period lithographs, usually satirical in nature, of women and sometimes men clinging to bedposts or other pieces of furniture while being laced up. So I know where they got the idea. It's just, those are satirical. They're not meant to be taken as this is what people do all the time in our time period. And for reference, just about every single living historian I know can get themselves dressed without assistance. There are some who like having the assistance but can do it themselves if there is no assistance available. So it is entirely possible to do it yourself. We see so many layers that were in common Western, free person's dress back then. What we don't always realize is the purpose of each layer, because each layer does serve a purpose. They're not just wearing clothes just to wear clothes. I think part of our, Victorians were so pious mindset, which is not necessarily true, kind of feeds into this, they were wearing so much clothing because they were, extremely pious and didn't want to show off any skin, which is not true at all. You look at some of these ball gowns in the late 1860s, and you're like, how is that not showing anything? It wasn't necessarily about showing. There are reasons why they wore so much clothing, and everything has a purpose. So let's kind of go through that a little bit here. Body linen, such as chemises and drawers, take the sweat and the body odors. So that keeps the body cool, it keeps the corset from shaping the body, and also it keeps body odors from really penetrating, and it kind of takes the body odors away from the body, which when you wash the garment and you put on a fresh garment really helps you smell nicer. So from what I've been reading, it seems that women do have quite a bit of body linen. At least half a dozen is mentioned. Typically, you see a week's worth of chemises, so like 7 or 8. 8 is very common. Up to several dozen chemises and drawers that these women are owning. These are average women that I'm looking at, not necessarily rich people. I don't like to look into rich people so much. I like to look into the average person. Stockings are necessary for odor control on the feet, also keeping the feet dry. Garters are necessary for the 19th century, and I see so many living historians leaving them off, which kind of grates me. That's a personal pet peeve, because even our modern reproduction stockings that we use have elastic in them, so we don't need garters necessarily for a lot of the stockings that we're wearing today, but elastic wasn't put into socks yet. And so, yeah, we kind of do need garters in the 19th century, and so I think a lot more living historians should be wearing them. You'd be surprised how much people can see on some of the skirts. I mean, when you're going upstairs and such, there are sometimes little glimpses of things that you probably don't think are being shown, but are. So it's always best practice to have all the layers that you need, just in case something gets shown. Boots and shoes serve obvious purposes to protect the feet. A corset actually serves multiple purposes, including its primary purpose, which is bust support. So bras are not invented yet. We are using the corset for bust support primarily. Also for back support. I love my corset for back support. When I'm working around the house and I'm bending over a lot and I start getting a little bit of back pain, I will go find my 1860s corset and I will put it on over my clothes, and that is amazing. It feels fantastic. A corset is also meant to smooth out the torso, so you get those close-fitting bodices and it helps things look nice. And the corset gives you a fashionable shape no matter the person's size. We see in period magazines and advertisements corsets that are specifically being marketed to the working class woman, working women, maids, other corsets that are specifically being called things such as common cheap stays. Even Mrs. Bowkett from the poorhouse lady has stays to wear. Of course, there are cultures and customs where people are wearing entirely different clothing from the Western civilizations, and they're wearing traditional dress. So obviously we're not talking about them, right? We are talking specifically, and I have a hard time finding a word for the type of people group I'm talking about, because it's not, I don't want to say the civilized people, because that's not necessarily true, but that's what the 19th century would have said. They would have said civilized culture. So part of me wants to just say that because we are talking about 19th century life, so we'll start using 19th century terms, but I know that'll offend some people. But I'm talking like Western dress for the, free people, mostly like, thinking like England, France, America, the Western frontier, the average free, and I only say white person because other people of other colors were assimilating and wearing these clothing as well, so I don't want to exclude them. So I just have a hard time encompassing everyone I want to talk about with the right terms. So if anyone has any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. But I think for the rest of this video, we are going to use the term civilized person, which again is not necessarily true, but is how people in the 19th century saw things. And so we're going to use their term. Just know that I understand that it's not fully encompassing, and I'm not using it in the modern sense. I'm using it in the historical sense. So the vast majority of these civilized people, or people who saw themselves as civilized, are going to be wearing corsets. Not everyone. Like, I have seen period images, and I'm like, you are not wearing a corset. But it is extremely obvious they are not wearing a corset. Their bust line is almost at their waistline. So they're not wearing any other type of bust support, because there really isn't. I mean, you can kind of bind your chest, but that's really not going to help much of anything. You might as well be wearing a corset at that point, unless you're trying to pretend to be a man. You might as well be wearing a corset at that point. There is no bra, there is no other bust container of sorts. You get a corset. And yes, it is extremely easy to see if someone's wearing a corset or not. I know a lot of thin living historians who think, oh, well, I'm thin, so I don't have to wear a corset, and you can't even tell if I'm wearing a corset. Yes, we can. We can all tell. It doesn't matter how skinny you are, we can tell. It's a matter of your bust placement, how the busts are setting, whether there's like one bust or there's two very defined busts. We can tell by the shape of your torso, because the natural body is a little bit more oval in shape, whereas in a corset it kind of rounds it out a little bit, so you kind of look thinner at the sides, but it kind of pushes out at the back and stomach, so you get much more of a round shape. So yes, we can tell if someone's not wearing a corset just by the shape of your body. We can tell by the shape and placement of your bust. So yes, we can all tell. Even if you think no one can tell, we can tell. And petticoats as a layer may seem very frivolous to us, They actually weren't, and I wear petticoats on a day-to-day basis because I too tend to wear long skirts, long, very full skirts. And I have found that if I don't wear a petticoat, my skirts get tangled up between my legs, and it's very annoying to try to walk. And you would think it'd be counterintuitive to add another skirt underneath. You would think it'd just be twice as much trouble. But for some reason, adding that petticoat keeps everything kind of spread out and nothing gets underneath my legs. And I have no idea how it works. It is not logical whatsoever, but it works. I don't know how it works, but it works. Especially if you start your petticoats as they were often doing. So by the mid-1840s, we're seeing a lot of pockets being put into dresses in their dress skirts, as opposed to having separate tie-on pockets. But earlier you had more tie-on pockets. So each layer really does have a purpose, and it can't really be left off. If you leave your chemise off, you're dealing with body odor, you're dealing with sweat getting onto your corset, you're dealing with, trying to lace a corset right over bare skin is never really comfortable. If you leave off your corset, you're not going to have the fashionable shape, you're not going to have the right bust placement, you're not going to have any bust or back support. You leave off petticoats, your skirts can get tangled up in your legs. You really can't do without any of the layers. They all serve purposes. So what would a working woman be wearing? And someone specifically who's maybe like laboring in the farm fields, because I use a lot of people like to use that, oh, I'm a poor farmer excuse, so I can't be wearing all that. Well, what was someone wearing when they were laboring? Well, it would contain the same layers. They're just, the layers may look different. They're going to be of maybe a coarser fabric. They may not be as trimmed as heavily or trimmed at all, but they're going to be wearing the same layers. So a working woman is still wearing chemise and possibly drawers. Drawers, again, some time periods we're wearing them, sometimes we're not. They are more common, again, in England, and then in the 1850s, really after the invention of the hoop skirts, when they take off for American women significantly. But they do seem to be somewhat optional even then. And even I've noticed in American lists of women on the frontier of how much clothing they're wearing, I've noticed that women tend to have a lot more chemises than they do drawers. And I don't know why, but it suggests to me that they're not wearing them quite as often. Working women are still going to be wearing corsets, however. Personally, I find, as a living historian, corsets far more useful in working class situations than when I'm being a pretty parlor ornament. Just for the back support alone, it is fantastic when you're doing work. And a working woman's corset may look very different from a wealthier woman's corset, but she's still going to have that layer. A corset should not impede your movements. If it is, it probably isn't the right corset for you. Just personally, I have a very long list of things that I'm able to do entirely in a corset. In period dress, I can scrub floors on my hands and knees. I chase after small children. I have cooked over hearths, stoves, and open fires. I've climbed trees in corsets. I've ridden horses in corsets. So many, many, many things I have done in corsets. A correct period corset should not cause you to not complete a task. And personally, I used to say things like, a thing I used to say all the time was, I can do absolutely anything in a corset that I can without a corset except yoga. And then I taught first grade for 8 years, and so we would do yoga in the classroom, and I was having bad back pain at a certain point in my life, so I started wearing my corset to work. And we were all doing yoga, and I was like, well, I guess we'll just try this out and see how it works. Turns out I can do yoga in a corset. Can I do every pose? No. I can do about 95% of what we were doing in the classroom in my corset. So now my saying is I can do absolutely anything in a corset that I can do without. No except, because apparently I can do yoga in a corset. And I haven't personally found that anything that I would do otherwise without a corset that I can't do in a corset. Now, if I can do it, as a modern woman who has not grown up wearing corsets, then a woman who's accustomed to wearing support garments from infancy probably is going to be able to do just about anything she wants to in a corset. And moving on from corsets, a working woman would wear at least one petticoat. Personally, I find that 2 is a really good option because you tend to lift your skirts up and pin them back when you're working, because your topmost petticoat is shorter and therefore you have a little bit more ease of movement. And so just so that petticoat doesn't get tangled up in your legs, again, you need a second petticoat underneath. So I tend to wear a smaller petticoat underneath and then a working petticoat over top, which is typically wool for me because I work a lot around fires and wool is flame retardant. So it will smolder, it will not catch flame. And so yeah, I pin my skirts back when I'm working, so lift them all up, either tuck them into apron strings or I pin them behind me or something else where they're just out of the way. And the reason I do so is we see so many, many, many photographs, paintings, lithographs of working women who have their skirts pulled back, revealing their petticoats. And again, they do this for multiple reasons. Petticoats, again, are shorter than dress skirts. So you have more movement when you tie up a dress skirt and just leave your petticoat. It also protects your dress skirt from stains, rips, burns, etc. and you're just dealing with a petticoat, which isn't going to be seen anyway, so it doesn't really matter if it gets a little, stained or burned or has holes in it. You mend those and you move on. And when I say there are so many period images of women working like this, I mean the vast, vast majority of images of working women that I have seen show them with their skirts pulled back. It's really astounding how frequently this is seen. And after trying it myself, I 100% understand. It is fantastic. I no longer do work any other way. Even in modern wear, I will pin back my skirts and just wear my petticoat if I'm gardening or doing anything that I would consider like a little bit of a harder work. I do the same thing because it is so nice, and I 100% understand why they were doing it. So when I'm in the 19th century, I do again wear a wool petticoat, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a old dress skirt that was cut down. You see that mentioned in period manuals as well, to cut down old dress skirts for petticoats. And it shouldn't add any discomfort, but I do highly suggest a wool petticoat. I mean, I personally have had a time where I did not pull my skirt back, and I should have, because now I have a skirt with burn holes in it, but I kneeled down and I didn't realize there was an ember underneath me. So I kneeled on an ember and my skirt didn't catch, but it did. I have some very significant burn holes in that skirt now, which is unfortunate because it's a very nice dress. But my wool petticoat, there is not a mark on it. And any of my underpinnings underneath, not a mark on them. I did not get burned. I didn't feel anything because that wool petticoat stopped everything. I was sitting there long enough, or kneeling in that ember long enough, to where had I been wearing all cotton, I would have burned my knee. I would have been hurt. I would have had to go get burn cream or something. That wool petticoat really helped that day. So I do highly suggest a wool petticoat to anyone who's working around a fire. Now, going to a working woman's dress in the 19th century would be typically a one-piece gown of either cotton or wool. Both are great working fabrics. Linen occasionally, especially if you're either in the deep south or earlier in the 19th century, that's more common as well. The two-piece separates that people like to wear are not correct. When separates are worn, they are very high fashion and a very fine and nice fabrics. So a one-piece dress is going to be the working woman's dress, either untrimmed or trimmed very simply. And by the way, I am using the term working woman, but there's so much nuance to that term. So a woman laboring in the fields is working. A woman in her shop making dresses or placing orders is also working. The rich local heiress who is manning a craft table at the local charity show is also working. All three of them are working. They're probably all going to be dressed very, very differently, at least to our eyes. They're going to be wearing the same layers, but again, their outer clothes especially, are going to look very different because they're all working in different ways. So I'm using the term working woman as a lower to middle working class woman, essentially. So instead of a collar, the working woman may choose to wear a kerchief around her neck, which is easily removable. And let me tell you, it is so nice when it's hot to dip that thing in water and put it around your neck. It's like 19th century air conditioning, and it is fantastic. For accessories, apron is a great thing. Either a half apron, which is just a skirt portion, or a bibbed apron that goes over your front and that pins with straight pins, not safety pins. If you're doing early or mid 19th century, it should be straight pins. There are ways to put them in to where you're not going to hurt anybody or get stabbed. Learn how to put them in correctly and there will not be an issue. Headwear for the working woman is likely going to be a sunbonnet, either a slat sunbonnet, which has wooden or pasteboard strips inside the bonnet, and that's what makes it stick out, or a corded sunbonnet, which is stitched channels where a yarn-like cord is placed in there, and that helps stiffen the fabric as well. These are usually starched as well. For winter, you're going to see things like quilted bonnets, that sort of thing. If you're in the early 19th century and open necklines for daytime are more common, you're going to want something to cover that to keep from being sunburned. Sunscreen isn't really a thing yet, so we want to protect ourselves. So a wider kerchief being worn over that or tucked inside your dress is going to be the way to do that. And all that to say, poor women are still wearing the same layers, even if the garments themselves look a little bit different. So the third myth I researched for this video was the myth of two dresses, which is a personal pet peeve of mine. It's the myth that I see constantly perpetuated. It's the myth that most women in the 19th century only own 2 or 3 dresses. From my current research, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I'm finding regular working class poor women having more than 10 outfits in their wardrobe to their name. I specifically talked about in the video a Mrs. Carrie Williams who kept a diary. In the last part of the 1850s, Mrs. Williams lived with her husband, young son, and her in-laws in California, post-gold rush in a mining town. Her husband was a minor. They didn't appear to have any spare cash. Mrs. Williams is constantly buying all her things from the peddler, so she's buying them secondhand. And she has a debt to that peddler she has to pay off at least once. Mrs. Williams also does her own laundry, which often in the 19th century, if you came into any money, the first household chore you would put out, so to speak, would be laundry. So she's doing her own. They do appear to be somewhat higher on the social class in this town, but they don't seem to have the funds to back up the social class. Mrs. Williams listed what she sewed daily, so she was an avid seamstress, and she listed everything she sewed. And so I counted how many garments she sewed just for herself, not for her son, husband, or friends, or family, or anything like that. Just what she got for herself. And these, again, are only the garments she worked on. You know, she was wearing other clothing that likely is still good before she finished all these things. So she likely has more than what she's actually working on. But just what she worked on, she specifically mentions 6 dresses ranging from calico to merino to silk. She has 3 wrappers, 4 bonnets, and various accessories, including caps and aprons. So 6 dresses and 3 wrappers is not shabby at all, but is that normal? Well, actually, yes. It's actually on the lower side of what I keep finding. And again, I am not speaking about rich people. I had a commenter accusing me of talking about royalty and queens when I was mentioning dress quantities, and I had to correct them saying, I'm speaking of poor women. This woman had debts. They were selling off furniture at a loss because they needed cash, and she had this many dresses. They don't have extra spending money. They are poor. I am talking about poor people. And over again, whether I'm looking out back west or in Texas, in England, France, or back east, I'm seeing the same thing. I'm seeing poor women owning at least 5 dresses. Even when I was looking into enslaved people's clothing, I saw more than once enslaved people being given 5 dresses a year. There's also a lieutenant's wife in Texas. Their house burned, and so they were listing to the government all the things that they lost so they could get them replaced. She had 3 silk dresses, 4 wool dresses, a waterproof dress, 2 wrappers, a riding habit, 2 muslin dresses, a linen dress, and 2 calico dresses. 13 dresses, and that's late 1860s in Texas frontier. A first lieutenant, which was what her husband's rank was making $600 a year, and that's not a lot of money even by 19th century standards. And since filming that YouTube Dressmith video, I found another one. Anna Alcott Pratt, who is the sister of Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. In Anna's own words, she says that she grew up in poverty, and even when married, her husband John only makes $500 a year, and he laments that he's not able to give her nice dresses or to take her on carriage rides. She calls herself poor at least on 2 occasions in her diary. So this is a woman who is self-proclaimed poor, okay? They lived for the first bit of their marriage in a 1-room house. So these are not wealthy people, but she does still own a sewing machine. She actually talks about remaking dresses, specifically remaking a shabby dress to try to make it appear presentable. She makes a dress for her sister Lucy, and she makes $1.50 from that purchase, which she promptly uses to buy cotton to make Lucy some underpinnings. She also gets some sewing from a friend, Mary, and she plans on using the funds to buy herself 2 cotton dresses, which we'll speak on this more in another video, but that means that she was buying fabric to make 2 dresses, not that she was buying actual 2 made-up dresses. Just trust me on that. In a month or so, we'll go over that. Interestingly enough, although she's taken on work with sewing to earn money, she actually talks about how much she hates sewing. So you do what you need to do sometimes just to survive, basically. And a few entries down, she talks about having enough work to hopefully earn herself a bonnet, and she talks about how much she enjoys earning her own things. Again, these are not wealthy people. These are folk who are just squeaking by financially. For her wedding wardrobe, Mrs. Pratt writes that she has 13 dresses. So yes, 13 again. She has a silk poplin, a gray wool barège, a drab challis, 4 muslin dresses, 5 calico dresses, a dressing gown, and a mud gown. She also has 2 shawls, a waterproof cloak, 2 mantles, 2 bonnets, a dozen pair of stockings, a dozen drawers, 14 chemises, 8 nightgowns, 2 corsets, 7 pairs of shoes, and rubbers. 18 pocket handkerchiefs, 6 white shirts, 3 flannel shirts, 1 moreen, and 8 aprons. She also lists off her wedding gifts, and these included some articles of clothing such as a Stella shawl, a piece of cotton, a dozen linen handkerchiefs, a silk apron, 2 chemises, 2 cravats, 6 ornamental handkerchiefs, and a muslin set. And this is early 1860s when she's married. I believe it's 60, 61, or 62, somewhere in there. And none of these sources are me cherry picking. Like, I'm not just picking, oh, this one has a lot of clothing, I'm going to talk about this one. These are literally the only sources I have for wardrobes right now. And they are all showing many, many more than 2 dresses. So I think it's very safe to say that your average woman, when we're talking about normal working class people, is having a lot more than just 2 or 3 dresses. And that'll just about wrap this up, our very first episode of the new podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my research into debunking these Victorian myths. I have very much enjoyed it, and I hope you did as well. The next episode will not be a myth-busting video. Instead, we're going to delve into the 1840s and go into my current research into the 1840s, as well as resources and how to reproduce 1840s articles of clothing. We are getting a reproduction town site here in Texas for the 1840s, the early 1840s specifically. And so I have been doing a lot of research into the 1840s because hopefully next year we'll have a place to go play. And so I need to go back to the 1840s. It's been a long time since I've made anything for the 1840s, and I really do need to go back and make sure I'm understanding all the pieces so then I can work through and curate myself a wardrobe for that particular time frame. So definitely be on the lookout for episode 2. If you have any questions or comments, you can find me in YouTube under Caitlin Kearns, or you can email me or find me on Instagram. If you're interested in watching the Victorian myth-busting dress video that I did, instead of just listening to it, like actually seeing me get dressed with a timer and everything, you can find that again on my YouTube channel. It's there under Victorian Dress Myths. And I hope you've enjoyed this very first episode. If you did, please leave a review on Spotify or on YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to tell me any topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes. Just a bit of housekeeping before we wrap up. I'm thinking we're going to do this podcast every other week, more or less. I'm thinking basically twice a month right now. So the 2nd and the 4th Wednesday is where I currently have new episodes planned. I would eventually like to get to the point where we're doing this every week, but with my current YouTube video schedule, I don't have time to add something else onto my plate every week. So I want to start this, see how it goes, see if it's of interest to anybody, and if it is, then great. We'll probably put it into a normal rotation, and I might just cut out some of the sewing, or at least not do as much, so that I can maybe just keep myself down to 2 main videos or podcasts a week, essentially. So like maybe 1 big sewing video and then 1 podcast for the week, because I don't have endless time, unfortunately. So if this is something you're very interested in and you would like to see more of this type of content, definitely let me know, because that will determine whether we get to go every week or not. And with all that being said, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the very next episode.